5 horses moving through darkness on a mountain trail that no sane person rode at night. Ahead, Boone Dawson led without looking, reading the earth by instinct, the way other men read printed words. Behind them all, 2 hawks guarded the path they had already crossed, his silence a wall between them and whatever Harlan Crane might send after. And in the middle, Eleanor Whitfield held a tin box against her ribs so tightly that the metal edge cut a line into her forearm. She did not loosen her grip. Inside that box was a photograph that could destroy the most powerful man in Shadow Creek Valley. 24 hours ago, she had been standing in her father's front room watching him place her hand into Harlan Crane's grip. Flat, final, without looking at her face. Now she was riding through the dark toward Abilene, toward the only judge beyond Crane's reach, and she had no second plan. She had 30 days the tin box and 3 strangers who had stepped through an open door and changed the geometry of her entire life. But that was later. That was the midnight ride, the desperate gamble, the race against a man who owned the county and the sheriff and the church roof and half the souls between here and the territorial line. This is how it started. This is the morning. Nora Whitfield had been awake since 4. Old habit. In her father's house, sleeping past dawn meant waking to decisions already made, papers already signed and conversations already finished that concerned her entirely and included her not at all. She had learned young to get up before the sun so she could at least see the trouble when it arrived. She was standing at the stove when she heard the wagon. 2 sets of boots on the front steps. Her father's voice first, low and careful. The voice Reverend Ezra Whitfield, reserved for powerful men and uncomfortable truths. Then the other voice, smooth, unhurried. The kind of voice that had never once been told no and had stopped expecting it. Harlan Crane. Nora set the cup down without drinking from it. She wiped her hands on her apron slowly because speed would reveal something, and she was not in the business of revealing things to men who had not earned the sight of them. She walked to the front room. Her father stood near the window, hat in both hands, turning it in slow circles the way he did when he was managing his own nerves. Ezra Whitfield was 62 years old and looked 80 on mornings like this one. His face carried the deep exhaustion of a man who believed with absolute sincerity that he was doing the right thing and had been telling himself that long enough to stop checking whether it was true. On the wall behind him hung a small wooden cross, and beside it, so faded it was nearly invisible, a pressed wildflower in a cracked frame. Nora's mother had pressed that flower the summer before she died. The summer she was carrying Nora inside her. The summer before the birth that took her life and her baby son's life and left behind only a girl that Ezra Whitfield never quite learned how to raise. He had hung the flower there the week after the funeral. He had never once mentioned it again. Not in 17 years. It was the only evidence in this house that Ezra Whitfield had ever loved anything he could not preach about. Nora looked at it for 1 second. Then she looked at Harlan Crane. He stood in the center of the room, the way a man stands when he is accustomed to standing in the center of rooms, silver at his temples, boots that had never touched actual ranch mud, a smile that arrived on his face a full beat before his eyes warmed to match it. 49 years old and comfortable in the specific way that only money made a man comfortable. "Eleanor," he said, "Miss Whitfield." She kept her voice level. "I buried my husband's name when I buried him." Crane's smile held. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. He held it out the same way he might hold a piece of meat toward a cautious animal, certain that hunger would eventually do his work for him. "I have come to discuss the Marsh debt. I believe we can settle this without involving the courts." "I am sure you believe that," Nora said. She did not take the paper. Crane set the document on the end table. "The note comes due in 30 days. The land goes to auction unless the debt is satisfied. I have a proposal. My household needs a manager. Educated, capable, 2 years of service, and I will consider the debt cleared." He said it like he was offering her a gift. Nora looked at her father. He was looking at the floor. Papa, look at me. He looked up, and there it was. Not cruelty, not indifference, relief. Plain, genuine, undisguised relief. The relief of a man whose problem was being solved by someone else. The relief of a man who had been carrying the weight of his daughter's existence for 22 years and was finally setting it down. She had grown up understanding that her mother's death had cracked something in Ezra Whitfield that would never heal. She had grown up understanding that her survival when her mother and her baby brother had not survived was a fact her father had never made peace with. She had understood all of this since she was 12 years old. It still hit her like a fist. "This is a good arrangement, Dorothy," her father said quietly. "Mr. Crane is a respected man. You would be safe." "Owned," Nora said. "That is what you are describing, Papa. 2 years in that man's house on that man's terms, working off a debt I did not create." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she hated it. "Vernon made that debt. Vernon made every debt he ever had, and you are standing here asking me to pay them with my life." Ezra's hand went to the small cross on his lapel without seeming to know he was doing it. Her mother's cross, the one Ruth Whitfield had worn every day of her short life. "I am not asking you to suffer," he said. "I am asking you to be practical." Those are the same thing. The front door opened, not a dramatic entrance. A man simply stepped through the open doorway, the way people step through doorways in small towns where knocking was optional and everyone knew everyone, except this man. Nora had never seen him before. He was tall, broad through the shoulders in the way of men who had done real work in hard country for a long time. A scar ran from his jaw to his collar. Old and settled, a scar that had finished being a wound years ago and was now simply part of the geography of his face. He had his hat in his hand, which was the polite thing, and his eyes on Harlan Crane, which was the direct thing. Behind him, a second man, slightly shorter but built the same way with a surveyor's careful eyes and a small notebook visible in his left hand. His ring finger was missing from that hand, and behind that man a third, the youngest. He did not come inside at all. He leaned against the door frame and watched with the quiet attention of a hawk on a fence post. "Mr. Boone said you had gone ahead," the first man said to Crane. "Said you were settling the Marsh note this morning." Crane's expression shifted 1 degree. "Dawson. Silas Dawson." Nora filed the name away, eyes the color of creek water over flat stones. Amber that changed depending on the light, knuckles scarred across all 4 fingers. The bearing of a man who had once worn a uniform and had been trying to forget it ever since. "Ma'am," he said, and looked at Nora directly and without apology, the way very few men in her experience had ever looked at her. Like she was standing in the room with a full life behind her eyes and he could see it from where he was. "I am Silas Dawson, my brothers Levi and Boone. We have the spread 2 miles east of your South Fork claim." "Neighbors," Crane said, made the words sound like an accusation. "That is right, which is why I have an interest in what happens to the land next door." "This is a private conversation." The door was open. Silas looked at Nora again, and he asked the question that no one had asked. Not that morning, not in the week since Vernon died, not in the 4 years of her marriage, not in the 17 years before it. "Ma'am, has anyone asked what you want to do?" The question landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Nora felt the ripples of it touch edges of herself she had sealed off years ago. She looked at Crane with his document. She looked at her father with his hand over her mother's cross. She looked at this stranger with his scarred knuckles and his steady amber eyes. And at the door frame where the youngest brother stood motionless watching everything. "No," she said. "Nobody asked." Silas nodded once, like that was the answer he had expected and not the answer he had wanted. "Then I would suggest we give her a minute to think." Crane's voice dropped. "You have no standing here, Dawson." "That is true. I am a neighbor asking a simple question." Silas set his hat back on his head. "But I will tell you this. There is not a judge in this territory who would look at what you just described and call it a clean settlement. Not with the woman standing right there saying she was not asked. The law gives her 30 days. 30 days. She does not owe you a single hour. Crane picked up his document, folded it, put it in his coat. His eyes stayed on Nora, and the smile that came back was the wrong kind of smile. The kind that meant postponed, not finished. The offer stands. 30 days, Miss Whitfield. He walked out. The room felt bigger without him in it. Nora looked at her father. He opened his mouth. She shook her head once, and he closed it. I need air, she said. She walked past Silas Dawson, who stepped aside to give her room without being asked. She noticed that, the stepping aside, the absence of the need to fill the doorway with himself. She noticed that the youngest brother Boone had already moved silently to give her a clear path. She noticed that too. She walked to the church at the end of the road and sat on the steps because they were empty, and she needed something solid under her. She was not going to walk into that building and ask anything of the God who lived inside it. Her relationship with her father's God was too old and too tangled to unpick on a Thursday morning. Silas Dawson found her there 10 minutes later. He sat on the bottom step, enough distance to be respectful, close enough to be present. He did not ask if she was all right. She appreciated that more than she could explain. You do not have to check on me, she said. You do not have to talk either. Good. 30 seconds of silence. A woman came out of the dry goods store, glanced at Nora, and looked deliberately away. The look of a town that had already written its opinion and was not revising it. People here have already decided what I am, Nora said. Vernon's widow, the Reverend's difficult daughter, the woman with bad luck in a gambling debt and no one willing to help carry it. People decide things fast in small towns, Silas said. Saves them having to think. And what have you decided? He turned his hat in his hands. I decided that a woman who does not flinch when Harlan Crane smiles that smile, who corrects him on her own name before he finishes his first sentence, who looks her own father in the face when she is the only one willing to. He paused. I decided that woman does not need saving. She needs room. That is a specific thing to notice about a stranger. I was a scout for 6 years. Noticing specific things kept me alive. He glanced at her. Your knees went for a half second when your father put your hand in Crane's grip. You pulled yourself back up so fast that most people missed it. You did not miss it. No, and that is why I walked in. He explained the rest. The fence line on the east boundary that shared a survey marker with her South Fork claim. If Crane bought the land at auction, he would push the marker. He had been pushing markers on every adjacent property he acquired for 18 months, and nobody had stopped him because nobody could. And if Crane pushed the Dawson marker, Silas and his brothers would spend the next decade arguing boundary rights with a man who owned the judge and the land board and the discretionary fund that paid the sheriff's salary. He said it the way he said everything. Plain, without apology, without dressing it up as concern for her when it was all a concern for himself. The way honest men stated honest reasons. So I have a practical interest in who ends up with that land. I will not pretend otherwise. Something about the honesty settled her more than reassurance would have. Vernon had always had reasons he did not tell her. Reasons that arrived wrapped in justification and tied with the ribbon of a man who believed his own excuses because examining them honestly would have required a kind of courage he did not possess. Her father had always had reasons he dressed up as scripture or as her own good, which amounted to the same thing in Ezra Whitfield's theology. This man sat on a church step in the morning sun and said, plain as weather, here is what I want, and here is why. And he did not look away while he said it. And he did not add a single word to make it sound better than it was. He offered the arrangement: fence work, survey work, fair wages, her own hours, no conditions. And if in 30 days they had not found a way to save the land, a horse and supplies in any town she chose. No debt following her, no obligation trailing behind her like a leash. just a clean road and the freedom to take it. Nora listened and did not interrupt. She was testing every word the way you tested ice before you put your weight on it, looking for the give, looking for the place where the surface would crack and reveal the cold water underneath. She had spent 4 years married to a man whose promises had surfaces and depths that never matched, and she had developed an ear for the frequency of a lie dressed in Sunday clothes. She did not hear it in Silas Dawson's voice. She heard something she had almost forgotten existed. A man saying exactly what he meant with nothing hidden underneath and nothing extra added on top. Why would you do that? The second part. His eyes came to hers and stayed there. Because your father had relief on his face when Crane walked in. And no daughter should have to see that on her father's face and then have nowhere to go. The air went out of her completely. She stood up, brushed the dust from her skirt. I want to see the fence line first, before I agree to anything. Fair. My own hours. Fine. If I decide it is not working, I walk. Miss Whitfield, you are not working for me. You are working with me. You walk whenever you choose. He held out his hand. Those are the only terms I have got. She shook his hand. His grip was firm and brief, and he let go first. Her father's boots sounded on the church path behind her. She did not turn around. She could feel him building towards something. An apology or an explanation or a scripture verse, one of the three, always one of the three. Dorothy, he said. She turned, looked at the cross on his lapel, at the tiredness in his face, the old tiredness. The tiredness that had been there since she was 12. Since the morning he came into her room and told her that her mother was with God now, and that God had his reasons and that they would not question them. She had been 12 years old, and she had wanted to scream that God's reasons were not good enough, that no reason was good enough for taking a mother from a girl who needed her, and she had looked at her father's face and understood with the terrible clarity of a child who grows up too fast that screaming would not bring her mother back and would only drive her father further into the stone fortress he was already building around himself. So she had not screamed, she had gone still. The same way she went still in the front room this morning when Crane held out his document. The same stillness she had practiced for 17 years until it became not a reaction but a way of living. You went still, you watched, you survived, and you got up before dawn so you could see the trouble coming. That flower in the frame, she said, the one on the wall, Mama pressed that the summer she was carrying me. She looked at him for a long moment. She would have asked what I wanted, Papa. Whatever else she was, whatever else you have made of her memory, in that silent place you keep it, she would have asked. His face did something she had not seen it do in years. It opened, just for a moment, just long enough for her to see behind it to the place where Ezra Whitfield kept the things he could not preach about, and could not pray away, and could not resolve with scripture or with silence. She saw grief in there. Old grief, 17 years old and still alive, still burning with the low, constant heat of a coal fire that would never go out because he had never let it. He had fed it with silence and distance and the theology of a man who believed that suffering and quiet was the highest form of faith. He had fed it with the cross on his lapel and the flower on the wall and the name he never spoke. And he had never once in 17 years considered the possibility that his daughter was burning too. She left him standing there. She went to get her horse. She made it to the south gate by noon with 4 minutes to spare. Silas was already there, crouched near the gatepost, examining something in the dirt. Survey marker, he said. The original one from the land grant. See how it has been moved. He pointed to a faint depression in the earth, maybe 8 inches from where the iron stake currently sat. That is where it was. Someone shifted it. Nora crouched beside him. The depression was real, a ghost of the original placement pressed into the ground like a scar. When, within the last year, ground still soft around the new placement, he stood up. Crane has been buying land on this side of the valley for 18 months. Every parcel he acquires, the survey markers on adjacent properties develop a tendency to move. Crane owns 3 members of the county land board. Levi Dawson appeared from behind the fence line carrying a post mallet. His voice was quieter than his brother's, the voice of a man who measured before he spoke. Complaining to them about Crane is like complaining to the river about being wet. Nora stood and looked at the marker, then at the fence line stretching east. So the fence work is not really about the fence. Something crossed Silas's face that might have been respect. The fence is real. The work is real. But you are right. It is not only about the fence. Levi pulled a worn notebook from his shirt pocket. I have been documenting every marker on this boundary for 6 months. Measurements, dates, witnesses where I could find them. His handwriting was small and precise, each entry exact to the quarter inch. The handwriting of a man who had learned that details mattered because structures depended on them. You have been building a case, Nora said. Which is why we need the marsh records, Silas said. Your husband filed a land survey when he took out the mortgage. That survey has the original marker positions. If we can compare those to what has been moved, we have documented evidence of fraud. The wind moved through the grass. Somewhere on the fence line, a loose post knocked faintly. Vernon kept papers in a tin box under the floorboard in the bedroom, Nora said. I have not touched it since he died. That is your property, your decision. Everything about this is my decision. Not sharp, not defensive, just stating the fact of it. Nora, she added. My name is Nora. Use it. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but the structural suggestion of one. All right, Nora. She picked up the loose fence post herself, set her boot against the base and pushed. Silas held the post steady while she drove it with the mallet. 3 solid strikes, the post sinking back into the ground with a decisive sound of something put right. They worked like that for 2 hours east along the fence line, moving in a rhythm that came not from planning, but from people who had each spent years working alone and recognized the efficiency of another person who did not require instruction. Silas found the problems. Nora solved the ones within reach. When one required both, they worked it together. Levi measured and recorded and built the case one data point at a time. And Boone. Boone appeared and disappeared along the tree line like weather. At one point, Nora saw him 200 yards east, crouched at the base of a cottonwood. 10 minutes later, he was gone. 20 minutes after that, she caught a glimpse of him on the ridge silhouetted against the sky. She understood then. He was the perimeter. He was the warning system. He was the part of this family that ensured they were never caught looking the wrong direction. And the way he did it silent and without announcement told her something about the Dawson brothers that their words alone would not have. They had been taking care of each other for a long time. They had systems. They had rhythms. And somewhere inside those rhythms, there was a space that had been empty since a woman named Catherine died of fever 3 years ago. And the house went quiet in a way that work and weather could not fill. Nora did not know about Catherine yet. That would come later on a different road in a different kind of darkness. But she felt the shape of the absence the way you feel a missing tooth with your tongue. Something had been here. Something important. And these 3 men had kept going without it, the same way she had kept going without her mother, and without Vernon, and without the version of her father she might have had if Ruth Whitfield had lived. You kept going. That was what people like them did. They kept going and they built things, and they did not talk about the cost of it because talking about the cost did not reduce it and might, if you were not careful, make it impossible to bear. Silas told her about the 6-year scouting for the Union Army, about the orders after the war to ride against people who had not fought and had no interest in fighting. In the morning, he put those orders on his commanding officer's desk and walked out. He gave up his pension, his rank, and most of the men who once called him brother. Nora told him about Vernon, the gambling, the 4 years of holding together something designed to fall apart. She told it even and without tremor, not for sympathy, because he had told her a true thing about himself, and it was fair to return it. I want you to understand that I know what it costs to walk away from the thing you are supposed to stay in, she said. I watched Vernon drink himself to nothing for 4 years, and everyone in this town called it my job to hold him together. When he died, half of them were disappointed in me for surviving without breaking. She held his gaze. I did not break. I am not going to break now. I see it clear, too, Silas said. I want you to know that. By late afternoon, they had covered nearly a mile and filled 3 pages with new measurements. Then Boone appeared beside Silas without sound. Rider on the South Ridge, Cade Crane, Harlan's nephew, been sitting there about 40 minutes. Nora did not look at the ridge. So Crane knows I did not take the deal, and by tonight he will know I spent the afternoon on your fence line. Does that change anything for you? Silas asked. She thought about Crane's smile. Postponed, not finished. It means we have less time than I thought. The Marsh house sat dark and closed against the evening sky. Nora went in through the kitchen, moved through the dark rooms without lighting a lamp. She did not need one. She had lived in this house 4 years. She knew where every floorboard gave. Bedroom, knelt. Third board from the wall, second from the window. The tin box was there, heavier than she remembered. She started to stand and stopped. On top of the box face down was a photograph she did not recognize. She turned it over. Vernon Marsh and Harlan Crane, standing in front of the Crane Land and Cattle Company office, shaking hands, the kind of handshake that men performed for cameras. Dated 8 months before Vernon died. On the back in Vernon's handwriting, she knew that handwriting. She had read 4 years of I Owe Us and broken promises in that handwriting. The arrangement is set. Crane gets the land one way or another. Best to cooperate. Nora sat on the floor of the empty bedroom in the dark for exactly 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, she understood everything. Vernon had not lost that money gambling. He had given it away and called it a loss so the land would default and Crane could take it. Whatever Crane paid him had disappeared into a bottle without anyone asking questions. 4 years of her marriage. 4 years of waking early and keeping the accounts and patching the roof and feeding the chickens and holding together something that had been designed from the start to fall apart. Not by accident, not by weakness, not even by the slow erosion of a man who could not stop drinking, which was the story she had told herself, the story the town had told. Itself the story everyone had agreed upon because it was sad but understandable and did not require anyone to look too closely at the man signing checks in the Craneland office. By arrangement. Her husband had arranged her ruin the way you arrange furniture in a room, deliberately, with purpose. And he had done it while she cooked his meals and washed his shirts and lay in the dark beside him, listening to him breathe and wondering what she had done wrong that she could not reach him. Nothing. She had done nothing wrong. There was nothing to reach. The man she married was a hollow thing wearing a husband's shape, and the hollow had been purchased by Harlan Crane 8 months before the body in it stopped breathing. She put the photograph in the box, put the lid on, stood up, walked out of the house. She did not break. She did not even bend. She added it to the weight she carried, and she kept walking because that was what Eleanor Whitfield did with weight. She carried it until she found the right place to set it down. In a dark bedroom in a dead man's house was not the right place. Silas was at the end of the South Road. He read something in her face before she said a word and said nothing himself. Just waited. She handed him the box. There is a photograph inside. Vernon and Crane, 8 months before the debt came due. Silas found the photograph, looked at the front and then the back. His expression flattened in the way of a man absorbing information that makes something simpler and worse at the same time. He was working with Crane from the beginning. My husband did not lose that money gambling, Nora said. Her voice was steady. She made it be steady. He gave it away and called it a loss so the land would default. Whatever Crane paid him disappeared into a bottle. 4 years of my marriage was a mechanism. What I need to know is whether that photograph changes what we can do. It changes everything. This is not a debt settlement anymore. This is documented collusion. Fraud. This goes to the territorial judge, above every person Crane has in his pocket. How long? A week to get word to Judge Harmon in Abilene. Crane moves faster than that. They rode back to the Dawson spread. Silas said there was a spare room and a lock on the door and coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. Nora said that sounded about right. She sat at the kitchen table with the tin box open and went through every document while Silas made fresh coffee and did not look over her shoulder. Levi sat across from her, his notebook beside the mortgage records. Boone stood near the window watching the dark outside because Boone was always watching something. That was the thing she kept noticing about all three of them. The deliberate architecture of how they occupied space. Silas led by asking, Levi built by listening. Boone guarded by knowing things before they happened. Vernon had been a man who filled rooms not with presence but with need. These three men moved through their own house like people who understood that space was something you gave, not took. The documents confirmed everything. Survey filings, mortgage agreements, 2 letters between Vernon and Crane's land manager. Vernon had agreed to default. The land was always the point. The debt was the mechanism. Nora went through Levi's survey data in 40 minutes, found 7 markers that did not match original positions. 3 bordered 2 Hawks territory. Levi stared at her. I have been sitting on that notebook for 6 months. I never once looked at the eastern markers relative to the hunting ground boundary. You were looking at your land, Nora said. I was looking at all of it. Then Silas said the thing that had been building behind his eyes all evening. Nora, I need to tell you something about the advertisement. Levi looked at him. Boone turned from the window. I did not place that ad only because we needed someone at the homestead. I had been watching the South Fork claim for months. I knew it was the piece Crane needed to connect his eastern holdings to the creek. When Vernon died, I knew that whoever ended up on that land would either be Crane's instrument or Crane's obstacle. He looked at her directly. I placed the ad hoping to find someone with the legal standing and the backbone to fight. I did not expect. You did not expect me to be this good at it. I did not expect you at all. The silence between them held something that neither of them named, not because they did not recognize it, but because naming it would make it larger than the room could hold right now. And there was still a man out there with 30 days and an empire and the willingness to burn things down. 3 taps at the kitchen window, low and deliberate. Silas was on his feet before the 3rd tap. He went to the window, looked out, and his whole body changed, tension dropping out of his shoulders. 2 Hawks, he said. The man who stepped through the back door was 40 years old and moved like water finding a path. He looked at Silas first, then at Nora, then at the documents on the table, then back at Silas. Cade Crane rode past my camp an hour ago. 2 men with him. They were not riding toward town. They were riding toward the marsh property. Nora was on her feet. I sent my nephew ahead to watch. They went inside. 20 minutes. Came out carrying nothing. He looked at the tin box. You were faster than they expected. By about 2 hours, Silas said. 2 Hawks studied the map on the table, put 1 finger on the 3 eastern boundary markers. You found them. 3 seasons ago, 2 Hawks said, I did not know how to use it. Nora told him everything, Vernon and Crane and the photograph and the survey records. She told it straight, no softening, just the facts in order. If Crane gets the South Fork, 2 Hawks said, the eastern boundary becomes his. He will push the markers until the hunting ground is quartered. He looked at Silas. You knew this. I suspected it. You should have come to me 6 months ago. Because asking for help felt like pulling someone else into my problem, Silas said. That is a very stupid reason. I know that now. Nora looked at Silas, and the thing she saw was not the steady man from that morning. She saw someone sitting with something true and uncomfortable, A man who had built his life in self-reliance so complete that asking for help had become indistinguishable from weakness. She knew that feeling from the inside. "Silas," she said quietly, "you told me this morning you were not offering to save me. Same goes. Nobody is saving anybody here. We are all just working at the same problem from the angles we each have." Something in his face loosened. Two hawks looked between them and filed something away. "I will ride with you to Abilene," Two Hawks said, "not to the judge's office. But I will ride alongside you through the mountain pass and make sure Crane's men do not follow you beyond the eastern ridge. I am not doing it for you," he added with something dry in it, the cousin of humor. "I am doing it because if Crane takes that land, I spend the next decade watching him eat through the boundary like fire through dry grass. And I am tired of watching fires." "That is a practical reason," Nora said. "But good reasons are," Two Hawks said, and he looked at her, and she had the distinct feeling she had passed a test she had not known she was taking. They rode out before dawn. 5 horses, the tin box wrapped in oilcloth in Nora's saddlebag, Levi's notebook in his shirt pocket, the sky still dark when they cleared the south gate, and the only sound was the horses and the wind and the distant voice of the creek that ran along the eastern boundary of land that was still for 30 more days hers. Two Hawks rode ahead, scouting the mountain trail with a silence and efficiency that came from decades of reading this land. He moved through the pre-dawn dark the way the creek moved through the valley below, not forcing a path, finding one. And the path he found avoided every ridgeline where a watcher might be posted and every draw where horsemen might wait. Nora watched him work and understood immediately why Silas had valued him for 6 years and why Silas had been wrong, profoundly and specifically wrong, to try to manage this without him. Some problems could not be solved alone. That was not weakness. That was arithmetic. Boone rode behind, guarding the rear the way he always did, because that was where Boone Dawson placed himself in every formation, every situation, every version of the world he moved through, between the people he had chosen and whatever might be coming from behind. He had not been asked to do this. He had not been assigned to it. He had simply, at some point in his 28 years, decided that this was his position in the order of things, and he occupied it with the same quiet permanence that the mountains occupied the horizon. Levi rode just ahead of Nora, his notebook in his pocket, his surveyor's eyes reading the trail for loose rock and unstable ground. Every few minutes he would glance back, not at Nora, but at the trail behind her, checking for the things that Boone was already watching for, because redundancy in the Dawson family was not inefficiency. It was love expressed in the language of men who had learned that the world took things from you without warning. And the only defense was to watch from more than one direction at once. Silas rode beside her. They did not talk much. But at one point where the trail opened onto a ridge with the whole valley visible in pre-dawn gray, he said, "You all right?" "Yes. You have not slept." "Neither have you." And Levi, riding just ahead, said without turning around, "None of us have. It is becoming a theme." Nora almost smiled. The almost was as close as she could get right now, and it was enough. At the valley road, Two Hawks stopped. He looked at Nora. "The judge who hears this, make sure he understands that the eastern markers affect more than your land. Say it plain, not as a footnote, as the point." "I understand." He held her gaze. "Vernon Marsh was a weak man who chose the wrong things. That is not what you are." "No, it is not." Two Hawks looked at Silas. Something passed between them. 6 years of honest neighboring that did not need words. Then he turned his horse and rode back up the mountain trail without looking back. And Nora Whitfield rode forward, into the rising sun, toward Abilene, toward the only judge above Crane's reach, the tin box in her saddlebag, and her back straight, and her hands steady on the reins. She had not slept in 24 hours, and she looked, Silas thought, like a woman who had been waiting her entire life for a problem she was fully equipped to solve. "Ready," he said. She looked at him sideways. "I have been ready since yesterday morning. You are the ones who needed to catch up. He opened his mouth, closed it, and for the second time in 24 hours, Silas Dawson found himself entirely without a response to Eleanor Whitfield, which was a new experience for him and one he was against all reasonable expectation, starting to find something close to indispensable. They rode toward Abilene into the morning, and the valley fell away behind them, and the road ahead was long and clear and entirely theirs to take. They reached Abilene by mid-morning, rode dusty and hollow-eyed from the sleepless night. Nora had exactly enough time to register that the town was 3 times the size of Shadow Creek before Silas was steering them toward a side street behind the feed merchant. Crane has eyes here too, she said. Crane does business in Abilene, which means he has people who owe him things here. Silas turned down a narrow street. There is a livery on Chestnut Street run by a man named Aldous Webb. He does not owe Crane anything because Crane tried to buy his property 6 years ago, and Aldous told him to go to hell in front of the county commissioner. The man holds a grudge like a religion. You know everyone who has ever told Harlan Crane to go to hell, oh, Nora said. It is a shorter list than you would think. I have memorized it. Aldous Webb was 70 years old, built like a man who had spent those 70 years arguing with horses and winning. He looked at Silas and said, Dawson. He looked at Nora and said nothing, which she was beginning to understand was a form of respect in this part of Colorado. The decision not to ask questions you had not been invited to ask. We need 2 hours, Silas said. You need sleep is what you need. Both of you look like death on a Tuesday. Aldous jerked his head toward the back. There is a room with a cot and a wash basin. Lock on the door. I will take the floor, Silas said. You will take the hay, Aldous said. The cot is for the lady. He took their horses without further commentary. Levi and Boone stayed with the animals, Levi checking the saddlebags, Boone positioning himself where he could see the street without being seen from it. The system continued to operate even on foreign ground, even when they were tired enough to fall standing up. Nora stood in the small room with the tin box under her arm and felt the weight of 24 hours without sleep pressed down on every muscle she owned. She sat on the edge of the cot. We should go straight to Harmon, she said. We should. Silas sat down on a hay bale near the door. But if we walk into his office looking like we rode through the night with something to hide, he is going to spend the first 10 minutes deciding whether we are credible instead of listening to what we are saying. He leaned his back against the wall. 1 hour, we clean up, we eat something, then we go in looking like people who know exactly what they have and exactly what it means. She hated that he was right. She hated it in the specific way you hate it when someone arrives at a conclusion you were already reaching and you have not yet decided whether to trust them for it. 1 hour, she said. She laid down on the cot without taking her boots off and was asleep in under 3 minutes. Silas sat against the wall and watched the door and did not sleep at all. When she woke 55 minutes later, there was a cloth-wrapped bundle beside the cot. Bread, hard cheese, 2 apples. She sat up and looked at Silas. Aldous, he said, do not thank me. She ate in silence. He ate his half standing up, looking at nothing the way soldiers ate, efficiently and without ritual. She thought about what Two Hawks had said the night before. 6 years of neighbor and Silas had come to his camp 4 times. Once for a sick child, once to return cattle, once to say he was not responsible for a fire. The visits of a man who showed up when there was something to account for and otherwise kept himself contained within the borders of his own life. Can I ask you something, she said. You have been asking me things since yesterday morning. You have not asked permission once. This one is different. She set the apple core down. Your wife. He went still. Not the way people go still when they are shutting a door. The way people go still when they are choosing whether to open one. You do not have to, she said. Her name was Catherine. His voice was quiet and level. She died 3 years ago. Fever, same week as the harvest. I was out in the east field when it turned, and I did not get back in time. He looked at his hands. She had been sick 4 days. She told me every morning she was improving because she knew I needed the harvest in before the weather turned. She did not want me to worry. Nora held very still. I found out later that the neighbor women knew how bad it was. They did not tell me because Catherine asked them not to. She was protecting me from the thing that would have made me come home. He paused. She died doing it. The silence between them was different from all the others they had shared. This one had weight. The weight of two people sitting in the presence of grief that it had been carried alone long enough to leave a permanent mark. I am sorry, Nora said. Not as filler, as a true thing. I spent a long time being angry at her for it, which was easier than being angry at myself for not coming home anyway. He looked up. That is why I do it. The deciding for people. The protective reasoning. I decided Catherine did not need to worry about the harvest. She decided I did not need to know she was dying. We were both wrong in the same direction, and by the time I understood that she was in the ground. I will keep telling you when I see it, Nora said. I would be glad of that. She stood up, straightened her dress, tucked her hair, picked up the tin box. Then let us go see Judge Harmon. The territorial courthouse was a two-story limestone building 3 blocks from the main street. It was the first building Nora had walked into in years that did not feel like it was arranged to make her smaller. Maybe that was the sleep, even 55 minutes of it. Maybe that was the tin box under her arm, the solid documented weight of evidence that had not existed in her hands 24 hours ago. Maybe it was simply that she had stopped somewhere on the road between Shadow Creek and Abilene, waiting for permission to take up space. Judge Harmon's clerk was a young man with ink on both hands who looked up and said the judge was in conference and could not be disturbed. Tell him Silas Dawson is here with documented evidence of land fraud in the Shadow Creek Valley involving Harlan Crane, Silas said. Tell him it is time sensitive, and tell him the woman with me is the defrauded party and she would like to speak for herself. The clerk looked at Nora. She held his gaze without expression. He went into the back office. He came out 90 seconds later. The judge will see you. Judge Harmon was 60 years old, narrow-shouldered, with the kind of face that had made a career out of giving nothing away. He looked at Silas briefly and at Nora at length, and she had the sense of being read. Not assessed, not judged preliminarily, but actually read the way a careful person read a document before signing it. Mr. Dawson, I know your name from the Eastern Valley dispute last spring. You filed a marker complaint that went nowhere. The county board, Silas said. Yes, sit down both of you, tell me what you have. Nora opened the tin box. She had arranged the documents on the ride ordered by date and relevance the way you ordered an argument before you made it. She laid them on the judge's desk in sequence. The mortgage agreement, the land survey with original marker positions, the letters between Vernon and Crane's land manager, and last the photograph with Vernon's handwriting on the back. She did not summarize. She let the document speak first. When she spoke to the facts, the dates, the discrepancy between original survey positions and current marker placements. What Vernon's handwriting on the back of that photograph meant in the context of everything else laid out on this desk. Harmon read everything, slowly. He asked questions, precise questions. The questions of a man who already understood the broad shape of what he was looking at and was testing the details. He asked Silas about the marker measurements in Levi's notebook. He asked Nora about the chronology of Vernon's debt. He looked at the photograph for a long time. Miss Whitfield, he said. Mrs. Whitfield. I go by my birth name. Harmon accepted this without comment. When did you first become aware of the arrangement between your husband and Harlan Crane? Last night when I found the photograph. Before that, I was aware that my husband made poor financial decisions. I was not aware that they were coordinated with a third party for the purpose of defrauding me of property. You understand that as your husband's estate, the debt is legitimate. The default is real. The default was engineered. Nora's voice did not waver. Vernon did not lose that money. He transferred it through a series of gambling losses that were arranged in advance to accounts controlled by Crane's associates. The debt was manufactured so the land would revert on a schedule Crane controlled. She held Harmon's gaze. That is fraud, Your Honor. That is conspiracy to defraud. And the survey marker movement on the boundary lines is the second half of the same pattern. Establishing new boundary positions before the land transferred so that when Crane took ownership, the documentation would show expanded holdings he never legitimately acquired. Harmon was quiet for a moment. You have been documenting the markers for 6 months, he said to Silas. My brother Levi has, yes. Why did you not bring this to me 6 months ago? Because I only had half the picture. The markers alone were suggestive, but not conclusive. I needed the Marsh survey records to tie it together. And you got them out. Mrs. Whitfield got them last night. Harmon looked at Nora again. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth exactly, but the professional acknowledgement of someone who had done a difficult thing efficiently. I am going to be direct with you. This case is solid. The documentation is thorough. In a fair court, Crane loses. He picked up the photograph. However, I am not the only judge in this territory, and Crane knows which of the others he can reach. The moment I issue an injunction, he will file counter-complaints in every venue available. Then issue it today. Nora leaned forward. He does not know we are here. His men went to the Marsh house last night looking for the documents and found nothing. He thinks we are still in Shadow Creek running out the 30 days. If you issue the injunction now, the land is protected before he can counter. Harmon picked up his pen, set it down, picked it up again. He wrote for 3 minutes without speaking. When he stopped, he blotted the page. Injunction on the South Fork property. No transfer, no auction, no access pending investigation. He wrote a second document. Subpoena for the Crane Land and Cattle Company's financial records for the past 3 years. He wrote a third. Notice of investigation into survey marker manipulation in the Shadow Creek Valley. He looked at Nora. If you can get me Two Hawk's testimony, even a written statement, I will enter it into the record with the same weight I would give any other witness. She picked up the injunction and held it in both hands. A single page, official seal at the bottom. Harmon's signature crossing the line. It was the most valuable piece of paper she had ever touched. And it weighed almost nothing. They walked out of the courthouse into the afternoon sun. Nora stopped on the boff step and stood there for a moment with the tin box under her arm and the injunction inside it, and Abilene laid out before her, ordinary and busy, and entirely unaware that something had just shifted. Then she heard boots on the courthouse steps below them. Coming up fast, Cade Crane stood at the bottom, red from hard riding, 2 men flanking him. He had figured it out. He looked at the tin box under Nora's arm, and she watched him understand. Whatever he told you, Cade said, jerking his head at Silas. Whatever you think you found, my uncle will have it dismissed before the week is out. Your uncle is welcome to try, Nora said. He will need to do it in Judge Harmon's court, on the record. With the documents he sent you to steal last night sitting on the other side of the table. Cade's jaw worked. He looked at Silas. You have made an enemy of the wrong family, Dawson. I have been a neighbor to the wrong family, Silas said. There is a difference. Cade looked back at Nora. He was trying to find the pressure point. She could see him looking, and she could see the moment he did not find it. The slight contraction around his eyes that meant the calculation had come up empty. This is not over, he said. No, Nora said. It is not, but it started, and it started on record. Tell your uncle Nora Whitfield said good morning. Cade looked at her for one more second, and then turned and walked down the steps, his 2 men following behind him. She watched until they rounded the corner. Silas said nothing for a moment. Then quietly, Nora Whitfield said good morning. I thought it was a nice touch. It was a very nice touch. He looked at her sidelong. We should get back on the road before he figures out which livery we are at. The ride back to Shadow Creek was where the distances between them began to close. Not the physical distances, though those had never been large. The other kind. The distances that people who have been hurt maintain between themselves and the possibility of being hurt again. The carefully measured spaces that become over time indistinguishable from the walls of a cell because they keep out the dangerous things and the necessary things in equal measure, and after a while you cannot tell which is which. Silas rode beside Nora and told her about Catherine, the full version. Not the facts he had offered that morning in the livery room, but the meaning underneath them. How he had spent the year after her death finishing the homestead expansion she had asked for. How Levi had built the kitchen addition she wanted alone in 3 days without sleeping, because building was how Levi said the things he could not say with words. How Boone had simply stopped talking for 2 months after the funeral, and when he started again, he spoke even less than before, and what he said carried more weight because of it. She loved all three of you, Nora said. Not a question. She loved Levi's hands, Silas said. The things he built. She used to say he could make a house feel like a home just by putting a shelf in the right place. He paused. She loved Boone's silence, said it was the most honest sound in the house. Another pause. And she loved me because I was stubborn enough to build something in country that did not want to be built in, and she wanted to see if I could do it. Could you? I did not know that until she died. Turns out you do not know what you have built until you have to live in it without the person you built it for. Levi dropped back at one point and showed Nora something in his notebook. A sketch of the homestead expansion he had been planning. A fourth room, a proper kitchen to replace the one that had been Catherine's. A porch facing south for the light. He did not say who the room was for. He did not need to. Nora looked at the sketch and looked at Levi and said, "The window should be wider. You get cross-ventilation." Levi's face did something she had not seen from him before. A smile that was not performing warmth but was genuinely surprised by it. Boone said almost nothing for the entire ride, but at one point when the trail narrowed and the horses went single file, he fell back to the rear without being asked. And when Nora glanced behind her, she realized he had been riding rear guard the entire trip. Not because anyone assigned him to it, because that was where Boone placed himself, between the people he had chosen and whatever might come from behind. She was beginning to understand that she had been included in that category without announcement simply by the fact that Boone Dawson had decided it was so, and Boone Dawson's decisions once made did not require discussion or revision or anyone else's approval to take effect. They reached Shadow Creek at dusk to find the Dawson homestead dark. Not dark in the way of an empty house, dark in the way of a house that has had something taken from it. Boone smelled it first. Smoke. Not fresh fire. The aftermath. The cold signature of something that had burned and finished burning and was now just ruin and memory and ash. The kitchen addition. The room Levi had built for Catherine. The room he had finished alone in 3 sleepless days after she died because she had asked for it and he was going to give it to her whether she was alive to see it or not. That room was burned to the framing. The walls stood like ribs. The roof was gone. The stone foundation Levi had laid with his own hands was blackened but intact. Everything above it was destroyed. Nora would learn later what that room had meant. She would learn that Catherine had wanted a kitchen with a window facing the morning sun so she could see the light come over the eastern ridge while she made coffee. She would learn that Levi had set that window at the exact angle Catherine described, measuring it 3 times because Catherine had said once that the difference between a house and a home was whether someone had cared enough to measure twice. She would learn that the shelf above the stove, the one now reduced to charcoal, and bent nails had been built to the precise height of Catherine's outstretched hand because Levi had watched her reach for things on shelves that were too high and had decided without telling her that she would never reach for anything in his kitchen. She would learn all of this later, from Silas in a voice that told her the telling cost him something he could not replace. But right now, in this moment, she did not need to know the details to understand the devastation. She could read it in the way the three brothers stood. No note, no message, no signature. Harlan Crane did not leave messages. He left consequences. He left the kind of damage that could not be attributed and could not be ignored and sat in the middle of your life like a stone in a river, forcing everything to flow around it. The three brothers stood in the ashes of Catherine's room. And Nora, standing in the doorway that no longer had a door, saw something she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Levi was absolutely still, not the stillness of a man thinking or a man preparing, the stillness of a man absorbing a blow to the one place he thought was protected. His hands, the hands that had laid every stone and cut every board and driven every nail in this room, hung at his sides like tools that had been set down because there was nothing left to build. His face was the face of a man discovering that grief which he had believed was finished with him had only been resting. Silas stood beside his brother with his jaw so tight that the scar from his jaw to his collar went white against his skin. He did not touch Levi. He did not speak. He stood next to him the way a man stands next to a wall that might fall, close enough to catch it, knowing that the catching might not be enough. And Boone. Boone had already walked the perimeter. Boone had already read the tracks and cataloged the hoof prints and noted the direction of approach and the direction of departure and filed all of it in the place where Boone kept the things he would use later at a time of his choosing in a way that the people who had done this would not see coming. Boone did not process grief by standing still. Boone processed grief by working the problem because the problem was something he could control and the grief was something he could not. And Boone Dawson had spent 28 years choosing the things he could control over the things he could not. Nora stood in the doorway and looked at the three of them and understood what Harlan Crane was willing to destroy. Not just land, not just property. This, the thing that Levi had built with his hands out of love for a woman he could never have. The physical evidence that grief could be converted into something useful. Crane had looked at these three brothers and found their weakest point and struck it with the precision of a man who understood that the most effective weapon was not force but memory. He had burned the room and left the foundation because the foundation was the part that would hurt. The foundation was the part they would have to look at every morning and decide whether to rebuild or walk away. And Crane was betting they would walk away. He did not know these men, and he did not know her. Nora stepped into the ashes. She picked up a charred beam and set it aside. She picked up another. Levi watched her. "What are you doing?" "Clearing." She picked up another beam. "You cannot rebuild until you clear." Levi looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up a beam. Then Silas. Then Boone came back from the perimeter and picked up a beam without asking why. 4 people. No words. The sound of charred wood being lifted and set aside, and the silence of grief being converted into action. They worked in the dark until the foundation was cleared. Every stone that Levi had laid with his own hands, exposed again to the night air, blackened, but solid, still holding the shape of the room that had been and the room that would be. When they finished, Nora's hands were black with ash and her arms ached in the headache she had been carrying since the church steps had been replaced by a different kind of pain. The kind that came from choosing to stand in someone else's ruin and help them clear it. The kind that meant something had changed between these 4 people that could not be changed back. Levi stood on the cleared foundation and looked at the sky through the space where the roof had been. "I will rebuild it," he said. It was not a promise to Nora or to Silas or to Boone. It was a promise to Catherine. "We will rebuild it," Nora said. He looked at her, and she saw in his face the quiet gratitude of a man who had spent 3 years grieving alone and had just been told without fanfare that he did not have to anymore. 3 days after the burning, Levi had already begun framing the new kitchen. Silas hauled timber from the north stand. Boone watched the perimeter with an intensity that had not diminished since the night of the fire and showed no signs of diminishing. Nora managed the operation with the same methodical attention she had given the survey records. She had a gift for seeing how things fit together, for understanding which task depended on which other task, for knowing when to push and when to wait. The homestead ran more efficiently with her in it than it had run in years, and all three brothers knew it, and none of them said it out loud because saying it out loud would make it a compliment, and compliments would change the nature of what was happening here. And what was happening here was too important to risk with the wrong word at the wrong time. The injunction was filed. Harmon's subpoena was in process. Crane had been quiet since the burning, too quiet, the kind of quiet that preceded something. Then the stagecoach came to Shadow Creek. Nora did not see it arrive. She was at the homestead working with Levi on the framing, holding a beam steady while he measured. The morning was clean and cold, and the work was good, and for a few hours she had allowed herself the luxury of thinking about nothing except the angle of a joint and the weight of a board, and the satisfaction of watching a wall go up where ashes had been 3 days before. Boone appeared on the porch and said without inflection, "Stagecoach, one passenger, old man, carrying a Bible." Nora's hands went still on the beam. She knew. Before Boone said another word, before she saw the figure walking up the road from town, before the shape of her father's silhouette resolved against the afternoon light, she knew. Because there was only one person in the world who would arrive in Shadow Creek carrying a Bible as if it were a shield and wearing the expression of a man who had traveled 1,000 miles to do something he had convinced himself was righteous. Reverend Ezra Whitfield, come to bring his daughter home. She went completely still. The same stillness from the front room. The same stillness from the church steps. The stillness she had practiced for 17 years. But this time, underneath the stillness, something was different. This time she was standing on ground she had chosen. This time there were people behind her who would not leave if she asked them to stay. "The conversation happens here," she said to Silas. "Not at the church, not at the boarding house, here." He nodded once. He did not ask why. He understood that she was choosing her ground the way a soldier chose ground before a battle, and that the ground she had chosen was the homestead, because the homestead was hers in a way that the church had never been, and the Whitfield house had never been, and the Marsh house had never been. This was the first place she had stood where the floor beneath her feet was a floor she had helped to build. Ezra came up the road slowly. He looked older than he had 4 days ago. Older and smaller and more certain, which was the dangerous combination because Ezra Whitfield at his most certain was Ezra Whitfield at his most deaf. He saw Nora standing at the homestead gate, and his face moved through 3 expressions in rapid succession: relief, guilt, and the beginning of an argument. She spoke before any of them could become words. "I went to Abilene. I have an injunction from Judge Harmon protecting the South Fork from auction or transfer pending investigation. I have documented evidence that Vernon conspired with Harlan Crane to manufacture the default on the land mortgage. And I have a subpoena in process for Crane's financial records going back 3 years. She paused. "Let each fact settle. Let the weight of them accumulate. I need you to hear all of that before you say anything." Ezra sat with his hands flat on the porch railing and his mouth closed. She could see him working through it. The sequence, the implications. He was not a stupid man. He had spent his whole life building careful arguments from established facts. "You rode to Abilene," he said, "with 3 men you had known less than a day. I need you to set aside whatever you are preparing to say about propriety, Papa, because propriety is not the issue. Harlan Crane conspired with my dead husband to steal my land. That is the issue." "I did not know about Crane," he said. "When he came with the offer, I thought it was reasonable. I thought it solved the problem. You did not ask what I wanted. You have not been asking me what I want since I was 12 years old. And that is a separate conversation that we are going to have eventually, but not tonight." She leaned forward. "Tonight I need to know that you understand what Crane is. Not a respectable businessman offering a fair arrangement. A man who conspired to take land through fraud and expected your daughter to hand it over out of desperation and gratitude." Ezra was quiet. The lamplight made him look old. Old in a way that had nothing to do with years and everything to do with the accumulated weight of a man who had been making decisions he believed were correct and was only now beginning to understand the cost. He came to my church, Ezra said. 6 months ago, he donated $300 to the roof repair. I know. I thought he was a man of community standing. He is a man of standing who used that standing to make sure no one in this valley could touch him. Nora looked at her father. He bought you the same way he buys everything, Papa, with something you needed and could not refuse. He did it before he needed you to look the other way. And then she understood, not just the church roof, not just the donation. She understood why her father was here, why he had traveled 1,000 miles, why he was carrying his Bible and wearing his most certain expression. He wrote to you, she said, before I ever refused his offer. He wrote to you weeks ago when Vernon died as a contingency. He told you your daughter was in trouble. He offered to pay your travel, and you came because a rich man told you your daughter needed saving, and you have spent my entire life believing I am something that needs to be saved rather than someone who deserves to be heard. Ezra's face broke, not dramatically, not with tears or collapse, in the quiet interior way of a man whose carefully maintained story about his own righteousness had just encountered a fact it could not accommodate. His hand went to the cross on his lapel, Ruth's cross. And for the first time, the gesture did not look like comfort. It looked like a man reaching for something that was no longer large enough to hold what he was feeling. Your mother, he said, his voice was rough. Your mother said something the morning you were born, before everything. He stopped, his hand pressed flat against the cross. She said, Dorothy has my eyes, Ezra. Make sure she knows they are good eyes to have. Nora did not move. She did not breathe. She waited for the rest. I never told you that. His voice cracked the same way hers had cracked in the front room 4 days ago, and she recognized the crack, and she did not hate it the way she had hated her own. She understood it. I should have told you that 17 years ago. I should have told you a great many things. She did not move. She did not speak. She let it land the way it needed to land, without rushing past it to the next practical thing. Because some moments required their full weight to be felt before they could be set down, and this was one of them. We will talk, she said finally. Not tonight, but we will talk. He nodded. He looked like a man who had been holding a door shut for 17 years and had just for the first time considered that there might be something worth seeing on the other side of it. The Dawson brothers had been present for this. At a distance, on the far end of the porch. Close enough to hear, but not interfering. Close enough to be there if she needed them, but far enough to make clear that this was her ground, and her conversation, and her choice about how it ended. After Ezra walked back down the road toward town, Silas asked her if she was all right. No, she said, but I am going to be, and that is what matters. That night she sat at the kitchen table with Levi and compared the final set of marker measurements against the original surveys. The case was airtight. 7 markers moved. 3 on Two Hawks boundary, documented, dated, witnessed. Boone came in from the perimeter and poured himself coffee and sat down at the table without speaking. After a while, he said, I tracked the hoof prints from the burning. 3 horses. One of them throws a shoe to the left. Same horse that Cade Crane rides. Nora looked at him. You have known that for 3 days. I have been waiting for the right time to mention it. When is the right time? When you had enough evidence that one more piece would not just add to the case, but make it impossible to ignore. He looked at her with his flat, unreadable eyes, and for the first time she saw behind them. Not warmth exactly, not the open feeling that Silas showed when his walls came down, or the surprised tenderness that Levi revealed when someone understood his building. Something different. The quiet recognition of one strategist acknowledging another. You have been thinking about this, she said. I have been thinking about all of it, Boone said, since the day you arrived. And what have you concluded? He turned his coffee cup in his hands. One rotation. That my brother placed an advertisement for someone who could help us fight, and what he got was someone who could help us win. He stood up and went back to the window, back to watching the dark. The conversation was over. It was also somehow everything that needed to be said. Nora sat at the table with the notebook and the surveys and the tin box and the injunction and the evidence of 3 horses and a thrown shoe, and she thought about a woman named Catherine, who had loved 3 brothers and been loved by them, and had died protecting one of them from a truth that would have saved her life. She thought about a kitchen built by grieving hands and burned by calculating ones, and being rebuilt now by hands that had decided without discussion to build together. She thought about what it meant to be in a place where people did not ask her to be smaller, where the space she took up was not resented or managed or tolerated, but simply made room for the way you made room for a load-bearing wall. Not because it was convenient, but because the structure required it. That night in the spare room with the lock on the door, Nora Whitfield slept for 8 hours straight. The first full night's sleep she had gotten in longer than she could remember. And when she woke, before dawn out of habit, she lay still for a moment and listened to the sounds of the Dawson homestead waking up around her. Levi's boots on the kitchen floor, the rhythm of Silas splitting wood outside, the creak of the porch where Boone sat watching the dark give way to gray already on the perimeter, already making sure the day arrived without incident. She thought about what Two Hawks had said on the Valley Road. Vernon Marsh was a weak man who chose the wrong things. That is not what you are. She thought about what Mae Marsh had told Vernon the week before he died, that he was making a mistake he could not undo. She thought about going to see Mae, about the tin box, about the photograph that explained everything and the injunction that protected everything, and the man in the boarding house in town who was perhaps for the first time in 17 years sitting with the weight of his own silence. She thought about Catherine's kitchen rising again from blackened stone, about Levi's hands building what Crane's hands had destroyed, about the stubbornness of people who refuse to stop building in country that keeps burning things down. She got up. She went to the kitchen. Levi handed her coffee without being asked. Through the window, she could see Silas at the woodpile, and beyond him, the ridge where Boone was already a silhouette against the early light. And the morning came, and the homestead held, and the foundation was solid, and there was work to do. 3 days passed, and in those 3 days, Nora Whitfield became something she had not been in a very long time. She became part of a household. The marriage had taken place on the 4th day after her arrival, not in the church. Nora would not have it in the church, and Silas did not ask why. A circuit judge passing through Shadow Creek performed the ceremony at the Dawson homestead with Levi and Boone as witnesses, and the afternoon light coming through the kitchen window that did not yet have glass in it because Levi had not finished the frame. It was brief and plain and legal, which was what it needed to be. Nora signed her name, and Silas signed his, and the judge signed his, and the document went into the tin box beside the injunction and the photograph and everything else that mattered. There was no ring, there was no music, there was no kiss because no music. There was no kiss because whatever was growing between them was not ready to be performed for an audience, and they both knew it, and the knowing of it was more intimate than any ceremony could have been. It happened without announcement, without negotiation, the becoming part of a household. It happened the way weather happened, gradually and then all at once, and then you could not remember what the sky looked like before. She cooked with Levi in the mornings. He was a surprisingly good baker. His hands as precise with dough as they were with lumber measuring flour, the same way he measured fence posts by instinct, refined through repetition until it was indistinguishable from talent. Nora was not a good baker. She burned things. She undermeasured salt. She forgot to check the oven until the smell reminded her. Levi said nothing about any of this. He simply adjusted. He moved the pan before she could burn it. He added the salt she forgot. He checked the oven when she did not. And slowly over the course of those mornings, they developed a rhythm in the kitchen that was not about cooking at all. It was about 2 people learning to share a space without collision. It was about trust expressed in the language of bread. She rode the fence line with Silas in the afternoons. They checked the markers. They documented. They built the case one measurement at a time. And they talked. Not constantly, not about important things every time. Sometimes about the weather, sometimes about the creek level and whether the east pasture would flood in spring. Sometimes about nothing at all, riding in a silence that had become comfortable enough to live in the way a house becomes comfortable, not when it is finished, but when you stop noticing the walls. She sat with Boone on the porch in the evenings. This was the strangest of the three relationships because it was built almost entirely without words. Boone would be there when she came out after supper, sitting in the chair at the far end with his hat pushed back and his eyes on the ridgeline. She would sit in the other chair. They would watch the dark come down together. Sometimes 20 minutes would pass without either of them speaking, and the silence was not awkward or empty or waiting to be filled. It was the silence of two people who had both spent years in the company of noise that meant nothing and had learned to value the absence of it. Boone spoke when he had something to say. Nora listened when he said it, and the rest of the time they simply existed in the same space, and that was enough. She was learning to read his silences the way he read the land, as a language with its own grammar and its own meaning. A shift in his posture meant something had changed on the perimeter. A slight turn of his head meant he had heard something the rest of them had not. And the rare occasions when he stood up from his chair and walked to the edge of the porch and stood very still, and his weight on the balls of his feet meant that whatever he had heard or seen was worth preparing for. He did this on the seventh evening, stood up, walked to the edge, went still. "What is it?" Nora said. "Ryder, coming from town, not Crane's people, different horse, Rayan. It was a boy from the general store. He carried a letter. The letter bore the seal of the territorial court in Abilene." Nora opened it at the kitchen table with all three brothers present. She read it once. She read it again. She set it down and pressed both hands flat on the table and breathed through the thing she was feeling, which was not fear and was not anger, but was something in between. The cold feeling of discovering that the ground you thought was solid has a crack in it that you did not see. "Crane has filed a counterclaim," she said. Silas picked up the letter. "Read it." His jaw tightened. He handed it to Levi without speaking. "He is arguing that the marriage is fraudulent," Nora said. "That the Dawson family arranged a mail-order marriage specifically to block the land transfer. That the marriage is a legal instrument rather than a genuine union. And that the advertisement is evidence of premeditation." The room was very quiet. "If he proves it," she continued, "the injunction collapses. My legal standing on the South Fork claim disappears. The auction proceeds." She looked at Silas, and he has a case, because the advertisement was partly strategic. You said so yourself. You placed it hoping to find someone with the legal standing and the backbone to fight. "If Harmon asked me under oath whether I married you for love or for the land, I will have to answer honestly. And you know what honest answers sound like when they are complicated?" This was the weapon she had not seen coming. Not a frontal assault, not another fire, not men on horseback in the dark. Something worse, something that used the truth or a piece of the truth as a blade. Crane had looked at what they had built and found the seam in it and was pressing his thumb into it with the patience of a man who understood that the most effective pressure was the kind that made things fall apart from the inside. Nora sat at the kitchen table after the brothers had gone to their separate corners of the homestead, and she looked at the letter and she thought about what it meant to answer honestly under oath. Because that was the thing about Nora Whitfield. She could strategize. She could document. She could outwork and outthink every man in this valley. But she could not lie. She had never been able to lie. It was not a moral position. It was a structural limitation. The same quality that made her good at numbers and good at details and good at seeing through other people's lies made it physically impossible for her to construct one of her own. Her mind worked in straight lines. It arrived at the truth the way water arrived at the lowest point, by following the only path available. And the truth about her marriage to Silas Dawson was complicated. It had started as an arrangement. She knew that, he knew that, Crane's lawyer knew that. The advertisement was evidence, and the advertisement was honest. And honest evidence was the hardest kind of fight because you could not call it a lie without becoming a liar yourself. But the truth about what the marriage had become, that was different. That was something Nora had been carefully not examining for 10 days, because examining it would require her to feel things she was not yet sure she had permission to feel. She had been a widow for less than a month. She had been in Shadow Creek for 10 days. She had known Silas Dawson for 10 days, and in those 10 days he had done something that Vernon had not done in 4 years, and her father had not done in 17. He had asked her what she wanted, and then he had listened to the answer, and then he had acted on it, and he had done this not once but repeatedly, consistently, with the dogged reliability of a man who had decided that her judgment was worth trusting and was not interested in revisiting the decision. That meant something. She knew it meant something. She was not yet ready to say what. Each brother responded differently to the counterclaim. And the responses told Nora more about who they were than anything they had said or done in the days since she arrived. Silas blamed himself. He had placed the advertisement with practical intent. He had brought Nora into this. If the marriage was invalidated, it was his fault. He withdrew, not from Nora, not from the house, into the silence of a man who was punishing himself for a mistake he had not finished making. He went to the east fence and worked alone. He did not come in for supper. He did not sit on the porch. He moved through the homestead like a man who had decided he did not deserve to occupy the same space as the people he had endangered. Nora recognized it because she had seen it in her father for 17 years. The theology of self-punishment. The belief that suffering in silence was the appropriate response to having caused pain. The certainty that pulling away was a kindness rather than what it actually was, which was another form of deciding things for other people without asking them whether they agreed. She found him at the east fence muss, the first one they had set together, the one she had driven with the mallet while he held it steady. She stood on the other side of the post and looked at him. "You are doing it again," she said. He did not look up. "Doing what?" "Deciding things for me. You have decided this is your fault. You have decided I should be angry. You have decided the answer is to pull away so I do not have to deal with you. And you have made all 3 of those decisions without asking me what I think about any of them." He was quiet. She could see him fighting it. The impulse to defend the withdrawal. The impulse to explain that he was trying to protect her. The impulse to be noble about it, which was the most dangerous impulse of all, because noble looks so much like good that most people could not tell the difference. "I married you with my eyes open, Silas. I knew what the arrangement was. I also know what it has become. Those are different things, and I am not confused about either one." He looked at her then. "What has it become?" "Something I am not willing to lose to Harlan Crane. That is what it has become. And if you need more than that right now, you will have to wait, because I do not have the words for the rest of it yet, and I will not say things I cannot say properly just because a man with a lawyer is trying to take them from me before I'm ready." Something moved across his face. Not relief, not resolution, but the beginning of both. The structural suggestion of a man who was going to put down the weight he had been carrying and trust someone else to help him carry it. "All right," he said, "I will wait." "Good. Now come inside and eat supper." Levi responded to the crisis by building. This was what Levi did. When the world broke something, Levi built something to replace it. He threw himself into the kitchen reconstruction with 16-hour days, refusing help, working by lamplight when the sun went down, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling, and feeling meant sitting with the knowledge that the room he was building might be taken from him again by a man with a piece of paper. Nora brought him coffee at midnight. She sat beside him on the new framing and did not tell him to stop. She did not tell him he needed rest. She did not tell him anything. She just sat next to him and drank coffee in the dark and let the silence do the work. After a while, Levi said, Catherine understood this. The building. She knew it was how I said things. I know, Nora said. You are not her replacement. I need you to know that. I know that too. I am not replacing anyone. I am adding. He looked at his hands, the hands with the missing finger, the hands that had built everything on this homestead that mattered. Adding is good, he said quietly. Adding is something I can work with. Boone responded by doing what Boone did, watching. But this time what he watched was Nora. And when she caught him at it, standing at the corner of the porch with his arms folded and his eyes on her the way they were usually on the ridgeline, he did not look away. You are going to have to say something eventually, she told him. He turned his hat in his hands. One rotation. I am not good at saying things. I am good at showing up. She considered this. Then keep showing up. He nodded once. That was the entire conversation. It was also everything that needed to be said. To counter Crane's challenge, they needed two things simultaneously. They needed to prove the marriage was genuine, and they needed to make the fraud case so overwhelming that the marriage question became irrelevant. Nora coordinated both strategies the way she coordinated everything. Methodically, precisely, with the relentless intensity of a woman who had spent her whole life being underestimated and had decided that being underestimated was a tactical advantage she intended to use until it stopped working. For the marriage, Mae Marsh came first. Vernon's mother, 60 years old, gray-haired with the bearing of a woman who had survived things by deciding early that survival was a reasonable minimum expectation. She had met Nora twice, once at the wedding, once at the funeral. Both times she had gripped Nora's hand with both of hers and looked at her with the expression of someone who knew more than she was saying. I will testify, Mae said. I will stand at that gate and I will say what I have been waiting to say for 4 years. That my son was a fool and the man who bought him was worse. She looked at Nora with the steady eyes of a woman who had spent decades watching men make mistakes and had run out of patience for all of them. You tell me when and where. Helen Garrett from the Mercantile agreed to testify as well, and Aldous Webb from Abilene. And then in an act that surprised Nora more than anything that had happened in the previous 10 days, her father agreed. Reverend Ezra Whitfield offered to testify that he believed the marriage was sincere. It was the first thing Ezra had done for his daughter in 17 years. That cost him something. Specifically, it cost him Crane's goodwill, which meant it cost him the church roof repair money, which meant it cost him the comfortable arrangement with a powerful man that had allowed him to believe he was ministering to his community when he was in fact being managed by it. Nora looked at her father when he told her. She looked at the cross on his lapel and the tiredness in his face, and the thing that was different about the tiredness now. It was lighter, not gone, but lighter. The lightness of a man who has been carrying a lie and has set it down and discovered that the muscles he had been using to carry it could be used for other things. Thank you, Papa, she said. He shook his head. Do not thank me. I should have done something worth thanking years ago. For the fraud case, Nora and Levi compiled the final documentation. Every marker position Levi had recorded against every original position from Vernon's surveys. 7 discrepancies. Systematic, undeniable, 3 on the two hawks boundary. The case was as tight as a dovetail joint, which was how Levi described it, because Levi described everything in terms of construction and was usually right to do so. And then Two Hawks arrived. He came to the homestead in the late afternoon, the way he always arrived, without announcement and without the sound of his approach preceding him. He was carrying something wrapped in deerskin. He set it on the kitchen table and looked at Nora. A missionary came through my territory 6 months ago, he said. He carried one of the new portable cameras. He was photographing the landscape and mountains, trees, the creek. He unwrapped the deerskin. Inside was a photograph, large format, printed on heavy paper. It showed a section of the eastern boundary. In the foreground, The landscape, trees, creek, the kind of image a missionary might take to show the people back east what the Western territories look like. In the background, visible but not centered, not the subject of the photograph, but undeniably present in it, two men were lifting a survey marker from the ground. Their hands were on the iron stake. Their bodies were bent with the effort of pulling it up. And 10 feet behind them, standing with his arm crossed and his weight on one leg, and the posture of a man supervising work he had ordered, was Harlan Crane. Nora looked at the photograph for a long time. She looked at Crane's face in it, the expression of a man who did not know he was being photographed. The expression of a man who believed he was invisible because he had always been invisible, because no one had ever been in a position to see him and record what they saw and hold it up later and say, "This is what you did, and here is the proof of it." "You have had this for 6 months, Nora said. "I had it. I did not have a place to use it. No court in this county would accept evidence from my hands. No judge would look at a photograph brought by a Ute man and give it the weight it deserved." He looked at her. "You told me that Judge Harmon said he would give my testimony equal weight." "He did say that. Do you believe him?" "I believe that this photograph makes belief irrelevant. This is not testimony. This is not a claim. This is Harlan Crane on camera watching his men physically remove a survey marker from the ground. No judge in any court in any territory can dismiss a photograph." Two Hawks looked at her steadily. Then he placed the photograph on the table beside the tin box and the survey notebook and the adjunction and the 7 pages of documented marker positions and the letter from Harmon's office and the evidence of 3 horses and a thrown shoe. "Then make sure it gets to the right hands," he said. He looked around the kitchen, at the walls that Silas had built, at the shelf that Levi had hung, at the window that Boone had replaced after the old one cracked in the first winter. He looked at these things the way a man looks at a neighbor's house when he has decided that the neighbor is worth knowing. Not with envy, not with judgment, with the simple recognition that someone had built something here, and the building of it said something about who they were, and what it said was worth respecting. "I will put the testimony in writing," Two Hawks said, "for the judge, the eastern markers, the hunting ground boundary, all of it." He paused. "I will also include the burning. My nephew watched Crane's men ride to this homestead. He watched them carry the oil. He watched the fire start. He is willing to say so." Nora looked at him. "You have been building your own case." "I have been building it for 3 seasons. I was waiting for someone to build beside." He looked at her the way he had looked at her that first night in this kitchen when she had told him everything straight and without softening, and he had listened completely and without assembling his response while she was still talking. "You build well," he said, "for someone who says she is not a builder." "I never said that," Nora said. "I said I was not a good baker." Something moved at the corner of Two Hawks' mouth, not quite a smile, the suggestion of one. The cousin of humor in a man who rationed his laughter the way you ration water in dry country, because you never knew when you would need it next. Silas stood in the doorway and looked at the table, at the accumulated weight of evidence that had started with a tin box under a floorboard and had grown piece by piece, day by day, into something that could not be ignored or dismissed or bought off or burned down. Crane's counterclaim about the marriage, Silas said, "It is going to look very small next to a photograph of him personally supervising fraud." "That is the idea," Nora said. Harlan Crane arrived at the south gate the next morning at 9:30. He arrived with his lawyer, a thin man named Corcoran, who carried a leather satchel and the expression of someone accustomed to winning arguments before they started. He arrived with 2 men who were not quite ranch hands and not quite anything else, the kind of men whose function was to make rooms feel smaller. He did not expect what was waiting at the gate. Nora stood at the gate post. In her hands, she held the injunction and the copy of the Harmon investigation notice and the photograph that Two Hawks had carried for 6 months. Behind her left shoulder, Silas, Not in front of her, not beside her, behind her, because this was her fight, and he knew it, and he had stopped trying to stand in front of her the first day they met and had not gone back. Levi stood at the fence with his notebook. The notebook that held 6 months of measurements in the foundation of a case that was about to collapse the most powerful man in the valley. Boone was on the ridge, visible, watching, a silhouette against the morning sky that said nothing and meant everything. Two hawks stood at the tree line, still and quiet, the way a man stands when he has decided to be visible and wants the fact of his visibility to speak for itself. He was not there as a witness. He was there as a statement. The statement of a man saying, I am here and I see you and I have been watching you long before today. Mae Marsh stood on the other side of the fence with Helen Garrett, two women from the town, two women who had been quiet for too long and had come today to stop being quiet. And Reverend Ezra Whitfield stood at the gate, wearing his dead wife's cross, his hands not on his Bible but at his sides. The posture of a man who had stopped hiding behind Scripture and was standing in the open for the first time in 17 years. He had given back the roof repair money that morning, $300 counted out and delivered to Crane's office by the boy from the general store, with a note that said simply, I cannot keep what was given in bad faith. It was unsigned. It did not need a signature. There was only one man in the Shadow Creek who would return $300 on a Thursday morning, and the returning of it said more about Ezra Whitfield's state of mind than any sermon he had ever delivered. Nora had not asked him to do this. She had not known about it until Levi mentioned it at breakfast casually, the way Levi mentioned things that mattered, as if they were facts about the weather that everyone already knew. Your father returned Crane's money this morning. The boy from the store told me when I went for nails. That was all. That was enough. Nora had stood at the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee in her hand and had felt something shift in her chest that she did not have a name for yet. Not forgiveness. She was not there. But something in the same territory. Something that acknowledged that a man who had been wrong for 17 years had taken one step in the direction of being less wrong, and that step had cost him something real, and the cost of it was the thing that made it mean something. Crane saw all of it, every face, every position, every piece of the geometry that had been arranged against him. His lawyer opened his satchel. Crane held up one hand to stop him. Miss Whitfield, he said. Mrs. Dawson. Nora's voice was level and clear and carried across the morning air the way voices carry when they have nothing to hide. I have told you that twice. I will not tell you again. Crane looked at the injunction in her hands. That document is temporary, a preliminary finding. It will be contested. Contested. Nora did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Contested in Harmon's court. On the record, a pound, with the letters between Vernon and your land manager on the table, with the photograph of Vernon shaking your hand 8 months before the debt came due, with 6 months of survey measurements documenting every marker your men have moved, with testimony from every person standing at this gate. She paused. Let it settle. I want you to contest it. Every day this case is in front of a judge is a day this valley gets to see what you have been doing to it. Crane was quiet. She could see him running calculations, the same kind of calculations he had run the morning he walked into her father's front room. Except this morning the numbers were not coming out the same. The land is not worth this, he said quietly. Just to her, the voice he used when he was being what he considered honest. Walk away. Let the auction proceed. I will ensure you receive fair compensation. The land is mine, Nora said. It was mine before Vernon signed anything, and it is mine after, because what he signed was fraud, and fraud does not transfer title. She took one step forward. I need you to understand something, Mr. Crane. I am not staying because of the land. The land matters because it is right, because Two Hawks' boundary matters, because every marker you have moved in this valley represents someone's life you have been slowly compressing without their knowledge. She looked at him steadily. But I would have stood here with nothing but the injunction and my own name if that was all I had, because the alternative was going quietly, and I am done going quietly. Then she played the final card. She held up the photograph. Two Hawks' photograph, the one with Crane standing in the background, watching his men lift the survey marker from the ground. This goes to Judge Harmon this afternoon, along with the survey records, the letters, the financial documents, testimony from every person at this gate, and your counterclaim about my marriage is going to look very small next to photographic evidence of you personally supervising the fraud you say does not exist. Crane looked at the photograph. She watched his face change, not dramatically, not with the collapse of a man who had been caught, with the recalculation of a man who had believed he was invisible and was discovering for the first time that he was not, that someone had been watching, that someone had been recording, that the careful architecture of power and silence and money and leverage that he had spent 18 months constructing had a hole in it that was exactly the size and shape of a missionary's camera. Corcoran the lawyer closed his satchel. It was a small gesture, barely visible, but Nora saw it and understood what it meant. The man had looked at the documents and looked at the assembled witnesses and looked at the photograph and the judge's seal on the injunction and had made his own calculation. And his calculation had arrived at a different answer than the one his client was paying him to reach. He leaned toward Crane and said something low that Nora could not hear. Crane looked at Nora for a long moment. He looked at Silas behind her shoulder. He looked at Levi with his notebook. He looked at Mae Marsh, who was looking back at him with an expression she had clearly been saving for this exact occasion. The expression of a mother who had watched a weak man ruin her son and had waited years for the man who bought him to answer for it. He looked at two Hawks at the tree line, who did not move, who said nothing, whose presence alone was testimony enough. The testimony of a man saying, I have been watching you long before today, and I will be watching you long after. He looked at Ezra Whitfield standing at the gate without his Bible, and something in Crane's face shifted. The recognition that the man who took his money was now standing on the other side, that the $300 had been returned, that the church roof was no longer a lever, that the last piece of leverage he held in this valley had been handed back to him by a 62-year-old preacher who had decided apparently very recently that his daughter was worth more than a dry sanctuary. Harlan Crane turned his horse around. He did not say anything. He did not make a threat. He did not promise to return. He did not leave a final word for the record. He simply turned and rode south, his lawyer behind him, his two men behind the lawyer. Nora watched him turn. She watched the lawyer follow. She watched the two men fall in behind. And just before they passed beyond hearing, she said in a voice that carried the way truth carries when it has nothing to hide, "Tell him Nora Dawson said good morning." Silas beside her said nothing for a moment. Then quietly, "Nora Dawson said good morning." "I thought it deserved a second time," she said. And Nora watched him go and saw something she had not expected to see. She saw a man who was not defeated. Harlan Crane was not the kind of man who was defeated by a single morning. He was the kind of man who absorbed losses and recalculated and came back in a different shape. She knew that. She was not naive enough to believe that this was over. But she also was a man who had looked at a photograph of himself and realized that he was visible. That the thing he had believed about himself for 18 years, the story he had told himself about being untouchable, was a story, and stories could be revised. And the woman standing at this gate with an injunction in one hand and a photograph in the other was the person who had revised it. Not with money, not with power, not with any of the currencies Crane understood, with documents, with facts, with the unyielding, relentless, unanswerable weight of evidence assembled by a woman who noticed details because details were the only thing that could not be taken from her. He rode south, and the sound of his horse faded down the valley road until it was gone, and the morning was quiet again, and the valley held its breath and then released it, and the creek went on running the way it always had, And the mountains did not move, and the sky did not change, because the mountains and the creek had been here before Harlan Crane and would be here after him, and they did not care about the affairs of men who believed they could own what could only be borrowed. Helen Garrett let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep and long held. Mae Marsh said nothing, but her chin lifted slightly. The small movement of a woman who had been waiting for a specific kind of justice and had seen it arrive. Two Hawks looked at Nora from across the fence. "I will put the testimony in writing," he said, "for Judge Harmon." "Thank you. The eastern boundary, if the markers are corrected in the investigation, I want the original positions documented permanently, not by the county board, by Harmon's office." "I will ask for it specifically, Wybam," Nora said. He nodded. He looked at Silas. Something passed between them. 6 years of honest neighboring. The kind of communication that happened between men who had been truthful with each other long enough that truth had become a shared language. Then Two Hawks turned and walked back into the tree line and was gone with the same quiet with which he had arrived. Mae Marsh came through the gate and stood in front of Nora and put both hands on her shoulders. The grip of a woman who had something to say and intended it to land. "Vernon did not deserve you," she said. "I knew it from the week he brought you home. I want you to hear that from his mother. Plainly. So it cannot be argued with." Nora's throat closed. She pressed her lips together and breathed through it. "I hear you," she said. Mae released her shoulders, patted them once, turned to Silas. "Dawson." "Ma'am." Mae looked between Silas and Nora with the expression of a 60-year-old woman who had watched 40 years of people being foolish about the obvious and had run entirely out of patience for it. "Do not be a fool," she said. Silas blinked. "Do not be a fool," she said again, and walked back toward town with Helen Garrett, the two of them talking in the low, purposeful way of women who had more to say to each other and were already saying it. Ezra Whitfield stood at the gate for a moment after Mae left. He looked at his daughter. She looked at him. And something passed between them that was not forgiveness and was not reconciliation and was not the resolution of 17 years of silence. It was something smaller and more important. It was the acknowledgement that the silence could end, that it did not have to be permanent, that the door he had been holding shut could be open, and what was on the other side of it was not the grief he had been hiding from, but the daughter he had been hiding it from. And she was standing right there, and she had been standing right there the whole time waiting for him to look up. He touched the cross on his lapel. Ruth's cross. And for the first time, the gesture was not a reflex. It was a choice. The choice to remember his wife not as a wound, but as a woman who had said on the morning their daughter was born, "Make sure she knows they are good eyes to have." He had failed that instruction for 17 years. He was not going to fail it anymore. He nodded once to Nora. She nodded back. He turned and walked toward town, his back a little straighter than it had been when he arrived. Nora and Silas stood at the south gate in the morning light. The fence line ran east toward the tree line and the creek and the mountains beyond. The South Fork stretched behind her. Her land, documented, protected, no longer a debt or a default or a mechanism in someone else's plan. The creek ran along the eastern edge, the same creek that ran along the Dawson boundary, the same creek that fed Two Hawks' hunting ground, the same water connecting all of them in a line that Harlan Crane had tried to own and could not. Behind them, the sound of Levi's hammer on the new kitchen framing, steady and rhythmic and sure. He had been building since dawn. He would build until dark, and tomorrow he would build again, because that was what Levi Dawson did with grief and with hope and with every feeling in between. He built, and what he built lasted, and the kitchen he was building now would have windows wide enough for cross-ventilation because a woman he had known for 10 days had looked at his sketch and told him to make them wider, and he had listened because listening was something Levi did when the person speaking understood that details mattered. On the ridge, the shape of Boone against the sky, watching, guarding, saying nothing because nothing needed to be said. He had been there since before dawn. He would be there until after dark. And somewhere in the quiet space between his silence and the world, he was keeping them safe the way he had always kept them safe, the way he would continue to keep them safe for as long as there was a ridge to stand on and people worth standing on it for. Nora looked at the fence post, the first one they had set together, the afternoon she arrived. The post she had driven with the mallet while Silas held it steady. 3 strikes, the decisive sound of something put right. That was 10 days ago. It felt like a lifetime. It felt like yesterday. It felt like the beginning of something that did not have an end she could see yet, and she was all right with that because endings were what happened when you stop building, and she had no intention of stopping. "I do not want to be careful anymore," she said. "I want to be honest." She turned to face Silas directly. He was standing 2 steps away, close enough to touch, close enough to see the amber of his eyes in the morning light and the scar that ran from his jaw to his collar and the way his hands hung at his sides, still and steady, the hands of a man who had done real things in hard country and was not finished. "I know what this is," she said. "What has been happening since you stepped through that door 10 days ago? I am 30 days out from a marriage that ended in fraud. I am not going to pretend that makes things simple, but I am also not going to stand here and pretend I do not know what I know." She held his gaze. "You told me you meant to be honest with me. I am returning it." He looked at her for a long moment. The morning was full and clean around them. The fence posts stood straight and solid in the ground. The survey markers were documented. The injunction was filed. The photograph was in safe hands. There was nothing left between them that needed to be managed or navigated or said with careful edges. He closed the distance between them in 2 steps and took her hand. Not the way he had taken it that first day on the church steps, firm and brief and professional. The way a man takes the hand of someone he understands to be both strong and worth being careful with. He brought her hand to his chest and held it there over his heart. "Still working," she said quietly. "Been working a little faster than usual for about 10 days, he said. She almost laughed. The laugh surprised her, the realness of it, the way it came from somewhere that had been closed off long enough that the hinges were stiff. She let it come anyway. She let it fill the space between them the way morning light fills a room. When you open the curtains after a long night, not all at once, but steadily, and then completely, and then you wonder how you ever lived in the dark. They stood at the south gate with the fence line running east and the creek running its constant course and the valley opening out around them. Behind them, the sound of Levi's hammer and the solidity of Boone's silence in a homestead that was being rebuilt by hands that had decided to build together. And somewhere in Shadow Creek, a 62-year-old preacher was sitting in a boarding house room speaking his dead wife's name out loud for the 2nd time in a week. And each time it came easier. And each time the room felt less empty. And each time the cross on his lapel felt less like an anchor and more like what it was meant to be, a remembrance, not a chain. Nora Whitfield came to Shadow Creek Valley with a tin box in 30 days and the unyielding stubbornness of a woman who had been told for 22 years what she was worth and had spent the last 10 days proving them all wrong. She came as something to be managed. She would leave this valley if she ever left it on her own terms and no one else's. And everything that happened between now and then, the testimony and the investigation and the trial that would come, and the slow, careful work of building something real with 3 men who understood that strength was not the opposite of tenderness, all of it would be hers. Her choice, her ground, her name. Not the Reverend's daughter, not the Marsh widow, not the woman nobody would help. Nora Dawson, standing on a foundation that would hold. She had stopped going quietly, and she was just getting started.